A well-dressed man walked calmly through the crowded airport terminal holding the hand of a little boy who said nothing. To most, they looked like father and son travelers on just another journey. His documents were flawless, his demeanor composed. His story airtight, but one German Shepherd. K9 trained to follow commands without question, sensed something no one else did. His ears twitched, his posture stiffened, and then he barked not once, again and again, louder and sharper, cutting through. The den of rolling suitcases and boarding calls, everyone around them turned in confusion. What no one knew, what even his handler didn't realize in that moment, was that Milo, the K9 dog, had just made a life-changing decision, one that would risk his years of training, challenge every rule in the book, and ultimately expose a terrible truth hidden behind a perfect lie. Before we dive into this gripping story of loyalty, instinct, and the courage to go against the grain, make sure to subscribe so you never miss powerful stories like this one, where silent heroes rise in the most unexpected ways. The day began like any other at Westlake International Airport, a major hub nestled in the heart of an American city brimming with summer travelers. It was just past 800 a.m. and the terminal was alive with motion, families off on vacations, businessmen with briefcases, backpackers charting their next adventure. Sunlight filtered through massive skylights, painting moving patterns across the polished floors. TSA agents manned their post with practiced precision, scanning IDs, checking bags, and keeping the crowd flowing. Among them was Officer Trent Harlow, clocking in for his third shift of the week, moving with the kind of steady calm only years of service could bring. By his side was Milo, his K9 partner, a sleek, alert German Shepherd with a coat like burnished bronze and eyes sharp as glass. Harlow and Milo had worked hundreds of shifts together, and their routine was ironclad. They swept checkpoints, patrolled exits, and occasionally paused to allow curious children to admire the dog from a safe distance. Milo was calm, focused, and never barked without cause. That discipline was his signature. His silence spoke louder than any alarm, but today that silence would be broken. They were midway through the upper concourse when Milo suddenly stopped. His body tensed, his gaze locked onto a pair moving through the crowd, a man in a navy suit holding the hand of a small boy with tousled hair and vacant eyes. The man walked confidently, exuding ease, nodding politely at passers-by. The boy, however, barely reacted. His head remained low. His small feet shuffled more than stepped. Milo stared without blinking, then with no visible cue he growled low and steady. A second later, his bark exploded into the air. Passengers nearby startled. A coffee cup dropped. A security officer looked over from the checkpoint. Harlow's eyes snapped toward Milo, momentarily confused. The bark wasn't his usual warning, it was something different, urgent, forceful, unwavering. He pulled the leash gently, but Milo didn't move. The German Shepherd held his ground, front legs planted, ears rigid, barking again, this time even louder. From across the floor, the well-dressed man hesitated. He adjusted his grip on the boy's hand and glanced toward the noise. His reaction was subtle, but Milo's growl deepened. Harlow tugged the leash harder, signaling him to move on. Still, Milo refused. For the first time in 2 years on duty, he was defying a direct order. The air shifted. Something had changed. The moment was heavy, an invisible thread tightening between the barking dog and the man, whose gaze now flickered with the slightest unease. Other agents began to take notice. The man quickly produced documents, a boarding pass, a passport, a custody authorization, all in perfect order. The child remained silent, pale, motionless. Everything looked legitimate, and yet Milo barked once more, sending a chill through the crowd. It wasn't noise. It was instinct given voice. The man was allowed to proceed. After all, paperwork didn't lie. But as he disappeared down the corridor toward the gates, Milo's eyes didn't leave him. Even as Harlow gently pulled him away, the dog kept looking back, his body low, his tail still, not out of fear, but certainty. Something was deeply wrong. And though the system said otherwise, Milo wasn't about to let it go. Milo barked again. It wasn't hesitation or confusion, it was conviction. Even as the crowd began to disperse and the echoes of his warning faded into the wide open space of the terminal, the German Shepherd remained rooted to the polished floor, his gaze unwavering. Something inside him would not let go. His handler tugged lightly, trying to guide him back to the assigned patrol route, but Milo stood firm, straining ever so slightly in the direction of the man and child, now blending into the sea of travelers. The dog's powerful body, usually fluid and obedient, had turned into a statue of resistance, every muscle flexed with purpose, every breath was a quiet protest, and behind those eyes there was a focus so intense it felt human. Passengers turned back one last time, curious to see what had caused the scene, then they continued with their lives, their departures, their destinations. But Milo remained behind, still troubled. His instincts, honed through rigorous training, sharpened by real-world experience, and refined by countless successful detections, had detected something that no machine, no database, no document could confirm. Something beneath the surface, something that had slipped through the cracks of protocol. Officer Trent Harlow finally managed to coax Milo away, though it felt more like surrender than command. As they rejoined the patrol route, Harlow's thoughts ran faster than his feet. He'd never seen Milo act this way. This wasn't about narcotics, it wasn't about explosives. This was different, something deeper. The dog had broken rank, violated routine, challenged the very structure of obedience he'd been built upon, and yet Harlow couldn't shake the feeling that Milo was right. Even without proof, even without logic, there was a truth in those barks that no badge or rulebook could silence. The concourse continued its relentless pace, the usual tide of bodies pushing forward. Gate announcements buzzed through overhead speakers, interrupted occasionally by the clang of luggage carts or the mechanical hiss of closing jetways, but amid that controlled chaos, the weight of the moment lingered. Harlow approached the security station, filing a soft flag report. Standard procedure, nothing dramatic, he mentioned. Milo's alert described the man's appearance, shared the minimal details. It was protocol, little more than a box to check. Still, it planted a seed inside the operations room. Surveillance footage began its slow rewind. The man and boy had passed through security unnoticed hours earlier. The cameras caught them moving silently, almost too perfectly. No luggage, no conversation, the man's hand gripping the boy's shoulder firmly but not violently. The boy's face expressionless, still unreadable. At first glance it all looked clean. The IDs matched, the itinerary checked out. There was no red flag to raise suspicion, but as a supervisor watched frame by frame, something began to feel off. The boy never looked up, never responded to his surroundings, never let go of the man's hand, not once. Meanwhile, Milo paced back in the TSA office. His usual posture of calm focus had vanished. His paws moved across the tile in steady rhythm, tail low, ears swiveling. He wasn't tired, he wasn't restless, he was waiting for something to justify what he knew. Harlow watched him closely, more troubled than he wanted to admit. Every handler is trained to prioritize protocol, but there comes a point where instinct speaks louder than instruction. And Milo's instincts had never failed before. An hour later, an analyst CH checked the custody paperwork. Something didn't line up. The child wasn't listed in the federal travel database, no school enrollment records, no insurance activity. His name hadn't surfaced in any recent filings. It was almost as if the child didn't exist, or worse, he did exist, and had disappeared. A quick photo scan triggered a potential match. An Amber Alert from a different state issued. 72 days ago, the resemblance between the missing child and the boy on camera was undeniable. Suddenly, Milo's bark took on new weight. This wasn't just disobedience, it was intervention. The alert was passed to federal authorities. Agents were mobilized quietly. No one wanted to panic the crowd. The flight was scheduled to depart within the hour, heading overseas. The clock had started ticking. There was no guarantee the man was the same person from the missing child case, no confirmation yet. But the risk of doing nothing loomed heavier by the second. Down by the terminal, boarding had already begun. The man walked calmly toward the gate, holding the boy's hand just as before. The child didn't speak, didn't resist, didn't look around. Everything about their movement felt practiced, controlled. Harlow stood near the entrance of the jet bridge, trying to look casual. Milo sat beside him, not moving, not blinking. As the man neared, Milo's ears lifted again. His body leaned forward slightly, every nerve alive. He didn't bark yet, but the storm inside him had returned, building again, stronger than ever, and the flight was moments from leaving. The boarding gate buzzed with low chatter and the occasional chime from the announcement system, but beneath the surface a quiet storm was gathering. Time was vanishing fast. The international flight bound for Lisbon was now minutes from final call, and the man in the navy suit had nearly reached the front of the line. The boy walked beside him, small and silent, just as before. But what no one saw, what only one creature truly sensed, was the weight of danger disguised beneath calm appearances. Milo, the German Shepherd K9, remained frozen near the boarding zone, his eyes burning into the back of the man's head. His breathing had slowed, his muscles coiled like springs. This wasn't a moment of obedience or waiting, it was restraint, deep, focused restraint. TSA agents flanked the area discreetly. They had no confirmation yet, just a high suspicion, and a possible match from a missing persons alert issued in another state. The photo compared to the boy had sparked a fire that now consumed the thoughts of everyone watching. But bureaucracy is slow, and danger doesn't wait with the man about. To step through the final gate, choices had to be made fast. Harlow's hand instinctively reached down to Milo's harness, a silent gesture of connection. He still didn't know the full story, but what he knew was enough. This wasn't a coincidence, it wasn't a false alarm, it was something real lurking just below the surface of routine. Milo had been trained to respond to threat signatures, to detect what human senses missed. He had never disobeyed a command until today, and that act alone now felt like the first domino in a chain that would either stop something terrible or come too late to matter. The gate agent looked up as the man handed over his documents, everything scanned perfectly, no alerts on the ID, no red flags from customs. The boy said nothing, offered nothing. His arm remained limp, his movements mechanical. His presence wasn't just quiet, it was eerie, like he wasn't really there at all, just behind the gates. Petition. 2 plainclothes officers received the match confirmation. The child was indeed identified as Charlie Wayne Mercer, a 9-year-old reported missing from a suburb in Illinois over 2 months earlier. He had vanished on his way home from school. His face had been plastered across news broadcasts, digital billboards, and social media pages for weeks, but no leads had ever panned out until now. And the person standing inches from international escape was not his father. He had no legal ties to the child. The officers moved quickly, but not loudly. A silent signal was passed as the man turned toward the final scanner. Milo lunged, not recklessly, not wildly. With calculated, deliberate movement, he surged forward, planting himself between the man and the boarding gate. His body was solid, his teeth bared, his low growl vibrating across the floor. Passengers gasped, some stepped back. The man froze, not from surprise, but because he knew. The cover was gone, the mask had cracked. Security swarmed, orders were barked, not by Milo this time, but by agents who surrounded the suspect. The man raised his hand slowly, carefully, but his eyes darted not to the dog, not to the officers, but to the boy. There was something unsettling in that look, like a final attempt at control. The child didn't move for the first time. He looked up, and what lived in his eyes was not fear, but confusion, as if waking from a long and dreamless sleep. Authorities separated them swiftly. The man was restrained and pulled aside, his face flat, his voice low. The boy stood alone for a moment. He didn't cry, he didn't speak, but something shifted in him. Something fragile and tentative, like a wall beginning to crumble. Milo didn't growl anymore. He simply sat down beside the boy, watching him, protecting him, as if to say, "You're safe now." Within minutes, the gate was cleared. The boarding resumed. The plane, once a vehicle for escape, now symbolized something very different: justice, narrowly claimed in time. Harlow stood off to the side, watching the boy being led gently into the care of child services. Milo stood next to him, calm again, alert, still watching the child. The handlers didn't need to speak. They understood the dog had made the right call. No protocol could explain it, but every part of it was right. Outside, the sky darkened as rain threatened on the horizon. The airport's rhythm resumed, planes landing, travelers moving, announcements echoing. But in the corner of the concourse, beneath a flickering overhead light, a storm had passed. One boy rescued, one man stopped, and one dog who refused to be silenced, even when it meant breaking the very rules he was trained to follow. And yet the day was far from over. He didn't speak a word, not even when the stranger who had gripped his hand was taken away in handcuffs, not when officers tried to comfort him, not when the plane left the gate without them. He simply stared ahead, silent, motionless, disconnected. Charlie Wayne Mercer had been found, but something inside him had not yet returned. His eyes darted at sudden movements. His posture remained tight, shoulders tucked, as if protecting himself from an invisible weight. Though physically unharmed, the boy's emotional state told a story deeper than any report could explain. He had survived 70 days with a man No one truly knew, and his body had adapted to that captivity in ways only time would unravel. Meanwhile, in the security observation room above the terminal floor, federal agents combed through footage again and again. The man now identified as Thomas Reeve was a ghost on paper, no criminal record, no digital trail. He'd used aliases, rented vehicles under burner identities, and moved from city to city like vapor. How he'd abducted Charlie remained unclear. Surveillance from the Illinois neighborhood where Charlie vanished had captured nothing more than a blur, a dark vehicle, a narrow window of opportunity, and then nothing. The technology that tracks so much of modern life had been outmaneuvered. What machines missed, a dog had sensed. Milo sat quietly beside Harlow in a room reserved for debriefings. Though this was no ordinary review, supervisors were cautious with praise, unsure how to categorize a violation of training. That led to the most critical breakthrough of the case. Milo's behavior had been off script, but results, especially those that reunited a missing child with the world he had been taken from, carried their own weight of truth. The kind that rewrote rules, the kind that couldn't be denied. Officers from several agencies filed through the terminal, discreetly interviewing passengers, collecting statements, and tracing every step Reeve had taken inside the airport. From the moment he entered the building, he moved with precision. He avoided eye contact, maintained constant proximity to the boy, never once released his grip. He hadn't checked bags, he hadn't made calls, there were no mistakes to review. If not for Milo's unwavering instinct, the man would have vanished across the Atlantic within the hour. The horror of what could have happened in the days that followed hung heavily in the minds of those now piecing the puzzle together. Outside the gate, the day carried on with its usual rhythm, new flights, different travelers, luggage rolling across tiled floors. But those who had witnessed the confrontation earlier now saw the world a little differently. A barking dog, once considered a disturbance, had turned out to be a silent guardian. Something primal had stirred in Milo the moment he saw the child. It wasn't a signal taught through repetition or a cue, drilled through endless simulations. It was something deeper, an internal compass that didn't require explanation to be believed. Charlie was taken to a quiet office tucked away from the crowds. Medical staff examined him gently. No bruises, no visible injuries, but there were signs of neglect, mild dehydration, undernourishment, and the kind of psychological distance that professionals recognized immediately. Every question was met with silence. Every attempt at comfort met with a blank stare. Still, he allowed Milo to sit near him. When someone tried to lead the dog out, Charlie's hand twitched toward him, just enough to stop them. No words, just a gesture, but it was enough. As the hours passed, investigators located his mother. A call was placed to her small home in rural Illinois. The moment her voice cracked on the other end of the line, the weight of the past 70 days began to lift, if only slightly. Arrangements for her urgent travel to the airport were made. She would arrive by early evening. Until then, Charlie waited in quiet. He didn't ask questions, he didn't show fear. But his eyes, once lifeless, occasionally flicked toward the door, toward footsteps, toward movement. It wasn't recognition, it was hope returning in slow, careful pieces. Milo remained nearby, resting, but always alert. Harlow stood watch, his thoughts looping endlessly. The questions of how and why would haunt the investigation for weeks to come, but for now the focus was simple. Protect the boy, maintain calm, and wait for a reunion that had once seemed impossible. Evening approached. The sun dipped lower, casting gold across the windows. The day was winding down for most, but for one child, one handler, and one dog, it was just beginning to open a new chapter. It began with a slow blink, then a turn of the head, finally a subtle shifting of posture, as if the world had nudged him from behind and whispered that it was safe to move again. Charlie sat on the worn leather couch inside the quiet administrative office, watching the corridor through the glass door. It wasn't noise or commotion that caught his attention. It was presence. A change in the air. Footsteps from far down the hall began to grow louder, measured, careful, yet heavy with urgency. Everyone in the room had tensed. Time had slowed, thickening the atmosphere with something unspoken yet undeniable. The boy didn't flinch. He simply looked up and waited, not fully knowing why his heartbeat had changed rhythm. Milo was already on his feet. The German shepherd's head was tilted, ears perked, eyes locked toward the same hallway. He wasn't barking, he wasn't pacing, but his stance spoke clearly. Something important was about to happen, something that would alter the very structure of the long day that had unfolded around them. The door opened, a tall man entered, mid-40s, sun-wathered skin, sharp, jawline, dark coat, still carrying the scent of rain from outside. Behind him, another agent followed with quiet assurance, carrying a tablet and files clutched tightly under one arm. The child's case had rapidly escalated beyond airport jurisdiction. Now the FBI had taken full command. Their arrival had brought more than authority, it brought a tidal wave of questions, and a pressure to act quickly before answers slipped through cracks. The boy barely noticed the details. His eyes had found something else, the man behind the agent. Taller, brought, her shoulders, face strained with emotion, barely contained, hair disheveled, clothes wrinkled, boots scuffed from a rush journey, and most notably his eyes brimming with disbelief, fear, and something deeper, recognition. The kind that doesn't come from memory alone, but from a soul remembering its missing piece. It was Charlie's father, not someone pretending. Not a stranger, not a handler or a doctor or another well-meaning adult with a clipboard. This was real flesh and blood. And it shifted the atmosphere instantly. The boy did not run, he didn't cry, he didn't scream, but his breathing changed, his chest rose faster, his fingers curled. His eyes finally softened. The door between shock and healing creaked open with the kind of silence that only a child returning to safety can produce. Milo didn't move from his position. He watched them both, the father and the son, like a silent sentinel, knowing somehow that his job wasn't quite over. There was still a bond to protect, a trust to ensure, and the moment demanded stillness, not celebration. Harlow stood nearby, one hand resting lightly on the dog's back, both of them keeping the space secure. The scene didn't need words to carry weight. It only needed the boy's gaze locking onto his father's outstretched hand. The distance between them was only a few feet, but was a distance traveled across 2.5 months of fear, uncertainty, and stolen time. The agents began to retreat, giving them privacy while quietly monitoring from outside. Charlie moved then, not with haste, not in panic, but with a steady, cautious walk toward the man who had spent 70 days fearing he might never see his son again. The embrace that followed wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, tight, unmoving, as if both were afraid the moment might dissolve if they breathed too deeply. Milo lowered his body to the ground, still watching. Harlow stepped back slightly, his eyes scanning the hallway, ensuring their perimeter remained untouched. Though the situation had de-escalated, tensions still lingered. Reeves' capture had raised more questions than it answered. Motives remained unclear. His background was sterile, his finances untraceable. And now that his attempt to leave the country had failed, agents feared there might be others involved. Silent accomplices or unseen facilitators who had helped him stay hidden for so long. The father pulled his son in closer, pressing his face into the boy's shoulder. Charlie didn't resist. He stood in that embrace as though it anchored him to the real world, again a world with names, faces, places. He belonged, not a blur of airports, hotel rooms, and strangers' voices. Slowly, the numbness in his expression began to crack. His hand clutched at his father's coat. A single tear slid down his cheek, not forced, not dramatic, just honest, a release. Outside the office, the world remained unaware. Flights continued, bags rolled, voices echoed over the PA system. But within that small room, tucked behind layers of security, something extraordinary was happening. A boy was being returned, not just to his parent, but to himself. And while most believed the danger had passed, Harlow knew better. There were still threads unraveling, still shadows lurking in places no camera reached, and Milo, ever alert, would be ready for what came next. Not every rescue ends with applause. Some conclude with new mysteries rising from the ashes of relief. While Charlie rested in the arms of the man who had fought through grief and despair to find him again, a deeper question lingered. How had Thomas Reeve planned to disappear without leaving a trace? It wasn't just about the abduction anymore. The man had moved through a labyrinth of cities, border zones, and identification checks undetected for over 2 months. Nothing about him added up. No fingerprints in databases, no digital accounts, no family, no origin. It was as if he had been built, not born, and the deeper authorities dug, the stranger his background became. The footage from earlier in the day was being rewound again and again by technicians in a dimly lit control room above the security floor. Every angle showed the same detail: Reeves' calculated movements, his avoidance of human contact, the subtle way he shielded the boy's face when passing under surveillance lenses. He hadn't made mistakes. He had performed each movement choreographed, each step rehearsed. That level of precision couldn't be coincidence. It was deliberate. And if he was trained, the question now wasn't who he was, but who had trained him. Harlow paced just beyond the office where the father and son remained behind closed doors. Milo followed quietly, a shadow to his handler's unease. Though the air inside the terminal had begun to calm, tension hummed below the surface. Reeve had barely spoken since being taken into custody. No demands, no resistance, only silence and an unsettling calm, like someone who had already accepted what came next. But what unsettled Harlow most wasn't Reeve's stillness. It was the question of intent. Had the man acted alone, or was he part of something larger, something still unfolding just beyond reach? In the corner of the operations wing, a separate team was assigned to trace the boy's last 70 days. The data trail was sparse: credit card purchases from fake names, burner phones traced to nowhere, hotel rooms booked under stolen identities. There were reports of a man and boy matching their descriptions in 5 different states. But each time they had vanished within hours of being noticed. It was like chasing smoke in a storm. What the reports did reveal, however, was a pattern. Reeve avoided cities with strong surveillance. He moved at night. He never stayed longer than 2 days. But what didn't make sense was his choice to board an international flight from one of the most monitored airports in the country. That decision contradicted everything he had done before for someone so skilled in avoidance. Why risk a move so public unless he wasn't planning to get away, unless something had changed? Harlow reviewed the timeline again, trying to understand. Reeve had arrived 3 hours early for the flight. He had kept Charlie close. Never once did he appear nervous, no hesitation. But the oddest detail, one that kept gnawing at the back of Harlow's mind, was that he never looked back. Most abductors, once cornered, panic. They fight. They try to run. Reeve had simply stopped walking when Milo barked, almost as if he'd been waiting for it. Elsewhere, in a secured interview room, Reeves sat across from agents tasked with breaking his silence, but every tactic failed. No matter how they pressed, he said nothing. No fear, no emotion, just a faint smirk that came and went like a passing thought. What little they had recovered from his personal effects offered no insight, no IDs, no photos, no keys, only a single notebook filled with pages of numbers and strange symbols. Not a journal, not a confession, a code. One that no one in the room could decipher. As night began to settle over the airport and outbound flights thinned, Milo remained near the gate, his body tense, eyes sharp. He wasn't resting, not now. Harlow watched him, feeling the unease growing within himself, mirrored in the dog's every movement. The boy was safe for now, but the man who had taken him had brought more than danger. He had brought questions that had no clear answers. And the worst part was the growing suspicion that the real threat hadn't been caught yet. Agents prepared to move Reeve to a black site holding facility outside the city. They didn't want word of his arrest reaching public channels. Too many unknowns, too many risks. Charlie and his father were escorted to a secure hotel within the airport perimeter. Flanked by protection details on rotating shifts, Harlow volunteered to stay nearby. He didn't say why, he just knew something felt unfinished. And Milo ever still kept watching the crowd, because sometimes the danger you think you've stopped is only the beginning of what waits just beyond the glass. The van transporting Thomas Reeve never arrived at the federal detention facility. 40 meters outside the city, the transport lost communication for precisely 6 minutes. No radio chatter, no GPS updates. No visual from the security drones trailing at distance. When contact resumed, the vehicle was empty. No signs of forced entry, no tire tracks beyond the paved road. The 2 marshals assigned to the escort were found unconscious, alive, but without memory of what had happened. Blood tests returned clean. No drugs, no trauma, just a blank void where recollection should have lived. What remained was silence and the chilling reality that a man with no past had once again vanished without leaving a trace. News of the disappearance never reached the public. The official report listed a mechanical malfunction and rerouting error with all passenger transfer records sealed under national security classification inside the airport. However, where agents scrambled behind layers of locked doors, panic was beginning to spread. Reeve was no ordinary criminal, that much had become clear. But his ability to disappear within a controlled perimeter after an arrest in the custody of trained personnel pointed to something deeper, something systemic. Someone had helped him, and whoever they were, they had reached. Harlow stood in the airport's underground operation center staring at the live feed of every gate, hallway, and security checkpoint. Milo sat beside him, rigid and alert. The dog hadn't relaxed since the previous incident. It was as if Milo had sensed Reeve wasn't done that whatever had begun with Charlie's rescue was far from over. Harlow reviewed the data from the last hour, noting strange movement patterns near the outer employee service routes, an area usually reserved for catering and luggage transport. 3 unregistered personnel badges had pinned the scanners within seconds of each other, all of them fake, the same batch of forgeries used by Reeve. Upon entry across the building, a maintenance worker found an open panel near the lower terminal vault, an access point only visible if you knew where to look. No cameras pointed there, no patrols checked it regularly. It was a blind spot by design, originally created for ventilation access. It had become a forgotten passage through the bowels of the structure, one small enough for a man to crawl through unnoticed. Inside it, investigators found shoe prints fresh deep in dust leading away from the airport. Authorities scrambled to close every exit route. Flights were grounded without explanation. Passenger screenings intensified, but Harlow knew it was already too late. Reeve had slipped through a crack no one even knew existed, and if he had helped, there was no telling how far that network extended. Milo stood abruptly, ears tilting to a sound no one else could hear. The hallway outside the control room was empty, but the dog's body tensed, muscles coiled as if something unseen had passed nearby. Harlow followed Milo out into the corridor, every sense sharpened, every instinct alive. At that moment, a low-level technician reviewing flight manifestos flagged a name, an alias used by Reeve in a separate airport weeks ago, but the destination wasn't international. It was domestic, small-town, rural aerostrip, no towers, no real oversight, a perfect place to disappear. The new theory emerged quickly. Reeve was never planning to fly out of the country. The airport had been a misdirection. The real extraction point was somewhere far less guarded. Harlow received the update through his comms, his eyes narrowing. If Reeve had allies operating within the transportation network, then everything had to be reevaluated. The abduction wasn't an isolated crime. It might be part of a broader system. Children like Charlie might not be the only ones. This wasn't just about one boy, it could be hundreds, thousands, and if that was true, then Milo's instincts hadn't saved a single life. They had interrupted something far more terrifying. As the sun began to set beyond the distant city skyline, casting long shadows across the tarmac, Milo moved toward the nearest exit gate, sniffing along the seams of the door's tail. Low breath, shallow, his body language had shifted. It wasn't fear, it was awareness. Harlow followed closely behind, his hand resting near the clasp of the dog's harness. He knew what Milo had taught him earlier that day. Sometimes logic is not enough. Sometimes instinct speaks louder than reason, and somewhere beneath the concrete sprawl of the airport, in the maze of utility tunnels and forgotten ducts, a trail had just been opened. One only Milo could follow. Not every pursuit begins with sirens or the screech of tires. Some start in silence under fluorescent lights in places never meant to be explored. Deep beneath the terminal floor, Milo had locked onto something invisible to the eye, yet loud to his instincts, a faint scent thread winding through rusted metal corridors and dim utility shafts, the kind of path left behind by someone certain no one would follow. This wasn't a chase for show. There were no crowds, no cameras, no one cheering from behind caution tape. It was quiet, slow, methodical, but it was urgent, because every second Thomas Reeve remained out of reach meant another door closed, another chance lost, another child possibly never found. Harlow moved just behind Milo, crouched to avoid pipes and low-hanging beams. The flashlight strapped to his chest cut narrow beams through the dark, illuminating little more than the dust their boots stirred and the occasional rodent darting out of view. The path they followed was crude, lined with peeling insulation, exposed wiring and puddles of stagnant water, but it was deliberate. Each turn Milo took felt guided by something deeper than training. He wasn't guessing. He knew. Minutes became longer, stretched thin by the tension of pursuit without confirmation. There were no footprints to study, no voices echoing through the dark, only the unwavering certainty in Milo's posture. Harlow had worked with dogs for years, but Milo was different. The bond they shared wasn't built on commands or rewards. It was shaped by instinct, by trust, sharpened through moments where hesitation could cost a life. This was one of those moments. Eventually, they emerged into a forgotten service bay filled with crates, machinery, and abandoned uniforms layered in dust loading. Dock door sat ajar at the far end, its rusted wheels frozen in place. But what caught Harlow's attention were the remnants left behind: a half-crushed water bottle, a torn strip of fabric, and the faintest imprint of a boot heel in the grime. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Reeve had been here recently. Outside, darkness had swallowed the airfield. A thin fog crawled low across the ground, blurring the edges of vehicles and structures. The airport's northern edge, rarely used and seldom patrolled. Stretched out in quiet disuse, Harlow stepped through the bay with Milo. Pressed close, the fog dampening every sound in the distance. The faint hum of an idling engine flickered in, and out of earshot, a vehicle waiting. They moved carefully, using abandoned equipment as cover. Navigating toward the sound, a long, low cargo truck came into view, tucked between two decommissioned shuttle vans. No lights, no driver in sight, but its cargo hatch was open, and inside Harlow spotted rows of padded transport crates. Too clean to belong to airport supply teams, too uniformed to be repurposed gear. Milo stopped at the base of the truck nose, twitching, body stiff. Something about it wasn't right. Without warning, Milo lunged to the side, dragging Harlow down just as a shadow moved behind the nearest van. A flash of motion, the figure darting away low and fast. Harlow scrambled to his feet, unholstered his sidearm, and swept the area. No return fire, no voice. Just footsteps disappearing into the fog, but the trail was active again. Reeve, or someone protecting him, had been only feet away. Inside the truck, Harlow found evidence of movement. Scraps of duct tape, sedative vials, children's shoes bundled in plastic. This wasn't an escape vehicle, it was preparation for another extraction, another child, maybe more. The discovery shifted everything. Reeve's capture hadn't been an end, it had been an interruption. Whatever network he belonged to was still moving, still preparing, and now it was reacting before Harlow could process what came next. Milo pulled again, this time toward the airstrip beyond the lot. The dog was almost frantic now, sensing something urgent, pressing forward with a purpose more intense than before. Harlow followed without hesitation, leaving the truck and its evidence behind, because Milo wasn't chasing echoes anymore. He was leading towards something, something alive. As they pushed through the thinning fog, a structure came into view. A private hangar, unmarked and dark. No scheduled flights were listed for it. No recent inspections logged, but the door stood slightly open, and from within the faint flicker of movement shimmered against the walls like a warning. Reeve wasn't just escaping. He was meeting someone, and the next hour would decide whether another innocent would vanish forever or whether Milo once again would stop the unthinkable. Just in time, the hangar looked like nothing from the outside, just corrugated steel walls weathered by time. A padlocked gate swung open on a broken chain, a dusty access panel blinking faintly under years of neglect. But Milo's entire body locked tight the moment he approached it. His breathing slowed, his movements dropped to a crawl. He didn't bark, didn't growl, he just stared, head low, ears pinned back, tail frozen stiff. There was something inside that building, more dangerous than anything they had encountered so far. Not rage, not chaos, something calm, calculated, waiting, and whatever it was, Milo wasn't going to let it slip past. Harlow could feel it too, a change in the air, thick, heavy, soaked in an unnatural stillness, not silence, absence, the kind of hollow emptiness that only surrounds places where terrible decisions are made. He gripped his sidearm tighter, advanced with deliberate steps, eyes flicking to every corner, every shadow, his breath fogged in the cold air, slow and shallow. Each movement felt magnified, each creak of metal beneath his boots sounded like thunder against the hangar's dead hush. And still Milo didn't move ahead. The dog waited for a signal, not from his handler, but from the dark itself. Inside the hangar, light flickered from a single overhead fixture, barely enough to reveal outlines, just enough to expose shapes not meant to be seen. The crates lined against the far wall were not standard cargo containers. These were modified cages, padded, reinforced, fitted with restraints. Some open, some sealed, and one barely large enough to hold a child was still warm to the touch. It wasn't a storage room. It was a temporary holding area designed for someone or something that was meant to disappear. Harlow scanned the space, every muscle braced for movement, but it wasn't footsteps or voices that caught his attention. It was a scent, a sharp, sterile tang of medical-grade antiseptic mixed with the unmistakable undertone of human fear. Milo caught it first, his nose jerked to the left, toward a curtained alcove hidden behind a stack of crates. Without waiting, he lunged forward, pulling. Harlow, with precise force, the curtain tore open under his weight, revealing a narrow room with white tile floors and a folding metal table slick with residue. Chains bolted to the wall, a camera on a tripod, and a logbook open to a page dated only hours before, on it a name, Charlie. Beside it, an arrival time, a check marked no departure. Listed, heart-pounding. Harlow turned sharply, sweeping the room again. No signs of a child, no signs of anyone else. But the space wire of recent use, the kind of detail that couldn't be faked. Someone had been here very recently and they had left in. A hurry, a low hum, echoed from above a vent drawing air steadily out of the room. Milo leapt onto a crate, ears perked, and sniffed at the duct. He barked once, short and sharp, then scratched at the panel they had escaped through the ventilation shaft. Harlow knew he couldn't follow that route, but Milo could track from the outside. They raced from the hangar, circled around its perimeter, and picked up the scent trail leading toward the western boundary of the airfield. That part of the airport wasn't mapped for public use. It was meant for storage and long-term maintenance. Labyrinthine, industrial, disconnected from surveillance, a perfect route for someone who needed to vanish without trace. As they moved deeper into the maze of scaffolding and cargo scaffolds, something shifted in the air again. The sound of footsteps, light, rapid, panicked, echoed off the walls. Then a sharp clang, as if a metal hatch had slammed shut. Milo picked up speed, weaving through the pillars like a shadow guiding Harlow toward the source. When they rounded the final corner, they found it, an emergency exit, pried open, wind whipping through the crack. On the ground, a child's shoe lay, discarded, covered in dirt. Beyond the doorway, a narrow service road stretched toward the outskirts of the airport's property. Faint tire tracks cut through the gravel, fresh, the kind that didn't belong to airport staff, the kind that meant whoever had helped Reeve had come back with a vehicle F-ready, and they had someone with them. As Harlow knelt to examine the shoe, Milo stared into the night, his entire body vibrating with tension. He had led them this far, but the next move had to be precise. One mistake, and the boy would be gone for good, and this time there wouldn't be another chance. The chase had reached its tipping point, and somewhere just beyond the shadows, the enemy was preparing to make their final move. The gravel still vibrated from the weight of departing tires, but no sound followed, just the cold whisper of wind dragging the scent of burnt rubber into the night. Milo froze at the edge of the service road, nose twitching, eyes locked forward with unblinking intensity. He wasn't just tracking anymore, he was reading the earth, studying the disruption of pebbles scattered by the vehicle's momentum, picking up where tread marks overlapped with dust trails. This wasn't ordinary pursuit. This was a race against the final vanishing point. And if they didn't act now, everything would dissolve into the dark. Somewhere beyond this bend, a child was being carried farther from safety, deeper into the hands of something far more organized than one man with bad intentions. Harlow followed Milo's lead without hesitation. The terrain narrowed quickly. The service road, folding into a fence corridor meant only for maintenance crews. No lights illuminated this passage. The path ahead twisted sharply, bordered by mounds of discarded materials, shipping pallets and long-forgotten luggage carts rusting in place, a perfect escape route for someone who had memorized the skeleton of the airport's underbelly. Milo kept low, moving fast, turning suddenly toward an unmarked gate at the corner where two fences met. Its lock had been cut clean. The chain, still swaying through the opening tire grooves, continued, now veering toward an auxiliary loading yard. This section was used rarely, mostly for surplus cargo delivery trucks and emergency overflow. It backed up against a sloping embankment that led straight to a maintenance tunnel under a nearby interstate. Milo darted down the slope, paused, digging into the damp soil as Harlow slid behind him. Each step became more precarious, the ground unstable, the air thick with exhaust and decay, but Milo didn't falter. The scent had grown stronger, sharper, and it carried something new, fear. At the base of the embankment, hidden behind a cluster of discarded scaffolding, sat a dark blue van. Its engine still ticked from recent use. The license plate was covered with a strip of black tape. The side door was open just enough to show the corner of a blanket and a small handprint. Smudged on the inside of the glass, Milo growled low, his body tense, ready to strike. Harlow approached with his weapon. Drawn, heart pounding with the knowledge that this wasn't just a vehicle, it was a prison or worse an inn, but the van was empty. No driver, no passenger, just the faint warmth of bodies that had been there minutes ago. On the dashboard, a tablet blinked. With a frozen screen, navigation halted mid-route as if its destination had changed at the last possible moment. In the back, a juice box lay crushed, its straw snapped, and beside it a child's backpack half unzipped, still holding a book labeled with the name Charlie in faded blue ink. Then came the noise, not loud, not clear, just a faint metallic rattle followed by the crunch of glass underfoot somewhere nearby. Milo's ears perked, his head jerked left. Without hesitation, he bolted toward a chain-link fence that separated the yard from the edge of the tunnel system. A gate there stood ajar, as if someone had tried to close it quickly but failed to latch it. Harlow followed, pushing his body faster than caution allowed. Inside the tunnel, every sound was amplified, their footsteps, their breath, the low hum of electricity echoing from distant panels. They descended deeper into the shaft, navigating bends and branching paths, until they reached a larger chamber, abandoned and used, its walls stained with decades of neglect. At the far end, a door swung slowly on its hinges. Milo approached, stopped, and waited. Harlow took a step forward, gun raised, and entered. What he found made his heart stutter. Charlie was there, curled in the corner, eyes wide, silent, but alive. Ducted tape clung loosely to his wrists. A small cut marred his forehead. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He simply stared, frozen. In a moment, he didn't understand. Harlow dropped to his knees, reached out slowly, but before he could close the distance, Milo pushed forward, gently lowering himself beside the boy. It was Milo. Charlie reached for first as Harlow began securing the area, preparing to radio in the location. Another sound caught his attention, rapid footsteps echoing back through the tunnel. Not retreating, approaching. Someone was coming, not to hide, but to finish what they started. The rescue wasn't over, not yet, and Milo knew it. The tunnel suddenly breathed with motion, not from wind or machinery, but from footsteps, deliberate and unhurried, echoing in slow succession across the curved concrete walls. It wasn't panic that filled the air now, but tension layered with certainty. Whoever was coming didn't fear discovery. They welcomed confrontation, and the sound was growing louder, steady, confident, measured in a way that revealed purpose rather than desperation. Milo's ears sharpened toward the sound, his eyes narrowing with animal precision. The German shepherd stood over the boy body, poised between protection and pursuit, instincts sharpened to a lethal edge. He didn't bark, he didn't move. He waited, timing his response to the exact moment. The darkness cracked open. Harlow pulled Charlie gently to his feet and stepped back into the shadows, using broken crates as cover. He could feel the boy trembling, not from cold, but from memory. Memories too recent, too raw, still trapped inside his eyes like a storm that hadn't passed. Milo didn't break his stance, his shoulders tensed, his paws braced, and then the figure stepped through. It wasn't Reeve, it was someone else, taller, broader. A man built like he belonged in locked rooms and backroom deals, dressed in dark utility where that blended into the shadows. He carried no flashlight, no weapon visible, just a heavy silence and a gaze that scanned the space with surgical calm. He saw the van, he saw the mess, he saw the empty cage, and when his eyes found the boy, he didn't pause in surprise. He only tilted his head, registering the problem. He stepped forward. Milo's growl rose like a low drumbeat, not loud but unmistakable. A threat issued with full intent. The man continued, not hurried, just certain, each step a signal that he didn't fear opposition, didn't consider a dog or a single officer to be an obstacle. Harlow raised his weapon slowly, his breath held, firm hands steady, brain calculating distance, wind angle, but before he could move, the stranger turned sharply, vanishing back into the tunnel without a sound. Not a retreat, a maneuver. Something about his presence didn't belong in this setting. It was too smooth, too polished, as if he was used to operating where lines blurred and accountability dissolved in the shadows. Milo shot forward but stopped short at the edge of the corridor. He sniffed, turned, looked back at Harlow and Charlie. The trail wasn't gone, but the priority had shifted. Milo knew the target wanted a chase, but the boy needed a shield, and the dogs' loyalty had already been made clear. No mission, no command, no pursuit would ever matter more than protecting the life in front of him. Harlow carried Charlie, who clung to his neck with the quiet desperation of someone who had run out of screams. They backtracked through the same path they had followed in, but now every sound felt sharper, every shadow more alive. The escape wasn't yet complete. They had rescued the boy, but they hadn't escaped the danger, not yet back at the mouth of the tunnel. The van was still there, untouched. Its silent presence now felt like bait too easy to exposed. Harlow weighed his options, quickly glancing at Milo for unspoken guidance, the German. Shepard sniffed the perimeter, then ran across the lot to a small utility vehicle parked behind a stack of crates, unmarked, but idling, keys in the ignition, no driver in sight. Milo barked, once signaling they moved fast. Harlow placed Charlie in the passenger seat, secured the belt, then climbed in with Milo at his side. The dog turned once in the seat, looked back toward the tunnel's mouth, still empty, then forward again. They peeled out onto the narrow path, tires cutting across gravel, engine roaring in a sudden burst of defiance as they sped back toward the airport's perimeter. Lights came into view, searchlights from airport security, red and blue from distant patrols. The first signs of a system finally catching up with what had been happening under its own infrastructure. Harlow pulled out his radio, breaking silence with a rapid call-in, but even as he reported the rescue, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. In the rear-view mirror, he caught movement, a black vehicle merging onto the same access road, silent, sleek, accelerating fast. Whoever they had seen in the tunnel hadn't come alone, and they weren't done. Milo turned teeth bare, ready for what came next. The chase had only changed lanes, but the stakes had doubled now. They weren't just fighting to save the boy, they were fighting to survive long enough to get him to safety. The chase was no longer a threat whispered in shadows. It had exploded into full motion across the edge of airport grounds, where official jurisdiction began to blur with unlit service roads and forgotten storage zones. The black vehicle closed the distance with eerie precision, as if guided not by sight, but by knowledge of routes, of shortcuts, of how much time they had left to silence the truth before it could escape inside the stolen utility van. Milo sat between Harlow and Charlie, his frame coiled, every breath a calculation. The headlights behind them danced like predators, circling their prey, never blinking, never backing off. There were no sirens, no demands to pull over, just quiet aggression building with speed. Harlow gripped the wheel tighter, every muscle in his arms tensing as the van weaved past old hangars and discarded pallets, tires skimming patches of gravel with dangerous resistance. Milo's ears twitched. His head turned left, then back. He sensed not just pursuit, but intent. The vehicle behind them didn't just want to catch up. It was maneuvering to force a reaction. At this speed, one wrong turn could flip the van, one hesitation could end everything. But slowing down was not an option, not with Charlie pressed against the door, eyes wide, but dry, frozen in the quiet shock of survival. Every twist in the road brought a new risk, fences without warning, barriers with rusted hinges, blind corners that revealed nothing until you were already there. Milo's eyes never left the rear window. He didn't flinch, he didn't bark, but his body began to rise, steady and alert, prepared to act when instinct demanded. He was no longer just a K-9 trained to detect explosives or contraband. He had evolved into something more, an extension of intuition, a sentinel shaped by a moment that asked more than obedience. It asked for courage without certainty. It asked for sacrifice without orders. The black car suddenly accelerated, edging into the van's blind spot, wheels kissing the gravel with the soft hiss of precision tires. It swerved closer, not ramming but hinting testing, and then it bumped them. A calculated nudge. The van shuddered slightly but held its path. The second impact came harder, forcing Harlow to swerve. Charlie gasped, silently gripping the handlebar. Milo moved instantly, leaping into the back, bracing his body across the boy like a living shield. Harlow swung the van hard right, bouncing over a worn curb and through a gap in a chain-link fence barely wide enough for the vehicle. The black car followed, but slower. Its design meant for the smooth chase, not rugged terrain that gave them seconds, just seconds, but it was enough ahead. A fork in the access road split toward an aircraft service bay, open, lit, empty, except for scattered carts and fuel containers. Harlow drove straight in, then cut the lights. The van slid into a shadow behind a container unit just as the black vehicle surged past, unaware, vanishing around the corner. In a blink, silence returned, but it was not peace. It was pause, a breath between movements. Milo jumped back to the front seat, scanning the surrounding darkness, ears rotating to catch distant vibrations. Harlow leaned back for a moment, his heart pounding against the silent sweat collecting at his brow. Charlie didn't speak, didn't move. He only stared forward, body curled, expression locked in silent understanding. This wasn't over, not yet. Suddenly, lights flickered to their left, headlights high in deliberate A. Second vehicle, not from the direction they had come, but from the other side of the service hangar. The black car had signaled others. The exit route was blocked. Milo rose fully now. Shoulders tight, tail stiff, chest heaving. He looked at Harlow, then at the exit, and he moved out the door before either of them could react. Not recklessly, not randomly, he darted low, disappearing behind stacked luggage pallets and heavy fueling rigs, silent as a whisper on mission. Moments later, a sharp metallic crash rang out in the distance, followed by a hiss of vapor and the slamming echo of something falling hard. The headlights vanished. Then a second sound, an explosion of air and metal. Milo returned a few seconds later, paws blackened slightly, but unhurt. He leapt back, and the path was clear. They moved again. As they exited the hangar, the airport's main tower came into view, a checkpoint. Close enough now to feel like a finish-line security reinforcement exposure, and yet behind them the quiet remained too quiet for comfort. Milo watched the mirror. Harlow gripped the wheel. Charlie breathed, and the final act of this pursuit was just about to begin. The checkpoint was less than 200 YD away, but the stretch between it and the hangar felt like an open battlefield. The floodlights that illuminated the final access lane cast long shadows, too long to see what waited beyond them. The van's tires rolled forward with a pulsar-like rhythm, each turn a countdown toward safety or confrontation. Milo stayed standing, muscles coiled and posture tense, eyes fixed on the road ahead. Harlow kept his foot light on the gas, gauging every flicker of light, every twitch in the mirrors, while Charlie remained in his seat, hands clutched tight on his lap, gaze unblinking. The boy hadn't made a sound since the escape began, his silence now louder than the roar of engines or the crackle of radios. As they neared the checkpoint, two figures emerged slowly from behind the security booth. Uniformed, armed, posture steady. For a moment, the path felt secure, as if the worst was behind them. But Milo didn't relax. His stare intensified. His chest expanded in shallow, careful breaths. Then came a detail so subtle it would have gone unnoticed by any man, but not by him. One of the guards didn't hold his rifle like a trained officer. He held it loosely, finger already pressed along the trigger, as if expecting trouble rather than preparing to prevent it. Milo's reaction was instant. He didn't bark, didn't growl, but turned his head toward Harlow in one firm motion, locking eyes for less than a second. That was enough. The signal was clear. Instead of stopping, the van swerved abruptly to the left, bypassing the checkpoint entirely, tires screeching across the tarmac. The two guards reacted, one shouting into a radio, while the other raised his weapon, but they didn't fire. Not yet. Harlow cut across an auxiliary runway, dodging abandoned carts and wine-blown cones. As Milo leapt to the back and positioned himself between Charlie and the door, once more behind them, movement stirred again. Three vehicles, now headlights blinking on in synchronized formation. The threat hadn't faded. It had multiplied. They were in the wide open now, every direction offering either exposure or confusion. The airport's outer perimeter fence came into view, stretching like a spine of jagged steel across the night. Beyond its safety, but reaching it meant crossing the most vulnerable space in the entire complex. Milo's head darted toward a maintenance shack a few yards to their right, its doors slightly ajar, a generator running beside it. He barked once, short, sharp directive. Harlow understood. He veered toward it, jerking the wheel just as one of the pursuing vehicles closed in from behind. A sudden jolt threw the van sideways, the rear bumper scraping a guardrail, but they didn't stop. The van surged forward, crashing through the flimsy wooden wall of the shed. Metal screeched, glass shattered. Steam hissed into the air as the generator toppled and burst open, engulfing the scene in a fog of coolant and sparks. Inside the haze, Harlow made a calculated turn and stopped the engine. The silence returned, heavy and electric. The van now hidden behind a smoking shell. Their pursuers slowed, confused by the cloud and misdirection. Milo jumped down, crept to the shattered edge of the shed, and waited. The first vehicle screeched past, overshooting the turn. The second paused, lights flicking across the debris. Milo didn't move. Harlow's breath hitched. Charlie didn't blink when the third vehicle turned off its headlights, creeping into the fog. Milo tensed, and then sprang. The German Shepherd launched like a spear into the murk, his weight hitting metal and man with equal fury. A cry rang out, cut short by impact. The vehicle spun, briefly skidding to a stop. As confusion erupted, Harlow saw his opening. He restarted the van, accelerated through the fractured side of the shed, swerved around the downed car, and pushed hard toward the fence. Milo emerged seconds later, running alongside the van. Paused, slamming pavement body. Slick with effort, they reached the perimeter gate just as real airport security, now aware of the internal breach, arrived from the opposite direction. Floodlights turned inward, sirens echoed, orders barked from distant loudspeakers. Milo didn't pause. He led the van directly toward the guards, then stopped shut and faced them unwavering. Harlow slammed the brakes. Charlie stared forward, unable to believe it was real. As dozens of armed responders approached with suspicion and confusion, Milo stayed rooted, silent, proud, and waiting. And just like that, the turning point had arrived. The arrival of airport security should have brought calm, should have ended the chase and ushered in clarity. But instead, it unleashed a storm of confusion. Floodlights bathed the van in blinding. White rifles were raised, voices roared through megaphones, orders flew in every direction. The perimeter team had only fragments of the situation, and to them it looked like an unauthorized vehicle barreling toward restricted zones with an unknown child inside. An AK-9 unit gone rogue. Milo didn't flinch under the pressure. He sat squarely at the van's front bumper, blocking any advance muscles. Rigid gaze forward, as if daring them to question his purpose. The lead officer approached with slow precision, flanked by others who moved in formation. Harlow remained frozen behind the wheel, hands in full view, adrenaline laced with a rising dread. The child's presence only complicated things. Charlie stayed eerily still in the backseat, eyes wide. Shoulders hunched, not out of fear of the guards, but as though reliving something buried deeper. That was what Milo sensed more than anything else. That silent trauma, that wordless ache that told him this child had seen more than anyone should. Then came the crucial moment. Milo stood abruptly and walked to the side of the van. He barked, not a warning, not a protest, but something deliberate. One bark, then another, each punctuated by stillness. It broke through the tension like a crack in ice. The senior officer recognized the signal. Milo wasn't threatening, he was calling for inspection, inviting them to look inside to find the truth. And they did. Rifles lowered, steps slowed. A guard moved forward, cautiously opened the rear door of the van, and found Charlie sitting beside a duffel bag, clinging to a jacket far too big for him. The officer scanned the child's face and then froze. Recognition took a few seconds, then it hit like a punch. His hand flew to his radio, a flurry of urgent codes crackled out. In another moment, everything shifted. The rifles dropped entirely. Movements became swift but careful. Milo backed up and circled to Charlie, placing himself between the boy and the confused crowd that had now formed. Harlow stepped out, slowly, hands still raised, watching every face for signs of trust or betrayal. But the tide had turned. A miracle had occurred, and the people around them began to understand it. The officer who first recognized Charlie stepped back and relayed the confirmation. A child kidnapped 73 days earlier, declared a national alert, face printed on posters across the country. His sudden appearance now in the custody of a dog who disobeyed orders but followed his instincts sent a shock wave through the ranks. What had looked like insubordination was now heroism. Milo hadn't just broken rules, he'd cracked open the truth. The truth that a well-dressed stranger had fooled the systems, bypassed every document check, and walked through gates undetected. With a stolen life at his side, medical teams were called in. A tactical unit stood down the chain of command, scrambled to issue statements. Harlow was temporarily detained, not out of suspicion, but as protocol. He accepted it, trusting that the truth would soon vindicate him. Milo, however, was not escorted away. He was left to sit with Charlie, both of them ringed by officers now more curious than cautious. Every few moments the boy would look down at the German Shepherd beside him, his gaze softening just slightly, a tremble in his hand easing as Milo leaned in close. The hours that followed were a blur of formality statements, medical evaluations, and press alerts, but the bond between the K-9 and the child remained constant. Milo never left his side, even when airport protocol officers tried gently to pull him away. He stood firm, and no one dared challenge it. The boy was safe, the story was shifting, and somewhere far across the city another phone was ringing, another life was being appended by Hope in a sterile room lined with monitors and security personnel. Federal agents reviewed every angle of surveillance footage. They traced the timeline backward, every glance, every movement, every deviation Milo had made. They followed it all the way to that first bark at the terminal checkpoint, that single decision to disobey. That instant when instinct overrode routine back on the tarmac. Night had stretched deep into early morning. The city beyond the airport shimmered under a layer of mist and orange haze. Milo lay beside the boy, now asleep in a thermal blanket, his breathing steady, his form still coiled with purpose. There was no applause, no parade, just silence and the distant sound of rotors approaching the airfield. A helicopter landed near the private runway, its blades slicing through the dark like time itself had been split. A final chapter was on its way. The helicopter's arrival didn't echo like chaos. It moved like justice, calm yet unshakable, landing softly on the far edge of the airfield where barriers kept the public at bay. What stepped out of it wasn't an officer nor a high-ranking official demanding press, but something more intimate, something the boy hadn't seen in over 2 months. The frame of a man cloaked in exhaustion, led by grief, moved across the tarmac, not with urgency but with purpose. He didn't scan the area like law enforcement. He locked eyes with the first uniform who could point him toward the center of the miracle. His pace didn't waver, his steps didn't break, but with every footfall he edged closer to something he feared might still slip away. The guards stood aside, not by command, but by instinct, allowing the man through, like they too understood that the final piece of this long and winding day had arrived. In the glow of floodlights now beginning to dim under the soft hum of cooling engines, Charlie stirred. He didn't wake with confusion or startle, but with the kind of stillness that only trauma shapes. A hesitation in his eyes as they adjusted to motion, a pause in his breath as he sensed someone approaching. But Milo was already up, tail low and steady, not wagging, but present, alert but not tense. He didn't bark this time. He didn't need to. His job was nearly done. The man approached slowly, now feet crunching on tarmac, every breath sharp and weighted, his eyes locked not on the boy but on the dog who had sat guard like a soldier, refusing to fall for a moment. Neither moved, and then the boy's eyes lifted. Recognition was an instant. It came in layers like light breaking through fog, a twitch in his brow, a tilt of his head, a breath held longer than the last, and then it happened, a shift, soft and trembling like the earth beneath him had just remembered how to hold itself. He reached forward, not fast, not bold, but with a kind of fragile hope, and the man dropped to his knees, his arms out, unsure if they were allowed to close the distance, but they did. The boy fell into him, not with tears, but with silence. A silence so loud it shattered the stillness, pulling every eye around into the moment, forcing time to acknowledge what had been restored. Father and son, separated by darkness, now stitched back together by something no procedure, no system, no plan had anticipated. A bond rebuilt in the ruins of a crime that had nearly gone unseen. The father held on with everything he had left, and the boy didn't let go. Milo stood beside them, ears slightly back, body relaxed, watching. His part had been played not with violence or aggression, but with trust. Trust in what he felt, in what he saw, in what could never be explained through data or protocol. Around them, the personnel faded into respectful distance. The flash of cameras stayed away. No announcement was made. No ceremony called. The moment was too sacred for spectacle. It wasn't long before they were moved to a quieter place, a private room lit softly, guarded discreetly, where father and son were given warmth, food, space to breathe. Milo followed them in, curling beneath the bench where the boy now lay across his father's lap, finally asleep in safety. A physician checked him gently, asking nothing, simply confirming what mattered. He was alive, unharmed in body, though worn down to the bone in other ways. The father refused rest, but he allowed himself to hold his child close, his hands shaking, not from fear now, but from the slow return of relief. Outside, Harlow was cleared of all suspicion. Statements were signed, footage reviewed, and Milo's actions, though unauthorized, were declared the pivotal factor in saving the child's life. Reports were drafted to be archived. Though the story had already begun to spread, whispers turned to headlines, and headlines would soon fill screens, but Milo wouldn't know that he didn't need the praise. He didn't hear the applause gathering online or the calls from across departments. Praising his instincts, he stayed beside the boy even as hours passed, even as dawn painted the edges of the skyline in soft gold. The sun rose not with fire, but with grace, a quiet ending to a long day that had begun with routine and ended in something extraordinary. And as the light filtered through the blinds of that small room, the boy stirred again, his hand resting softly on the dog's back. No words were spoken, none were needed. Milo had disobeyed orders, but in doing so he had obeyed something greater, the unspoken call to protect the innocent, the silent promise all guardians make. He hadn't just saved a life, he had given it back. And in the stillness of that morning, where the noise of the world had yet to resume, a family was whole again. All because a King chose to listen not to the rules but to the truth only he could sense.